when military veteran Sarah Chen walked into the county animal shelter that humid August morning in rural Virginia. She had no intention of adopting anything. She was there purely to drop off donations, old blankets and towels from her late husband's storage unit that she'd finally found the courage to sort through. But when she saw a terrified 2-year-old German shepherd cowering in the back corner of the euthanasia-list kennel, something inside her snapped. What seemed like a simple act of mercy, saving a traumatized military dog that nobody else wanted, would soon expose a criminal operation worth millions of dollars, put Sarah's life in grave danger, and reveal that sometimes the most broken warriors carry the most explosive secrets. If this incredible true story of courage, corruption, and redemption moves you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You're about to witness something that will restore your faith in second chances. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Sarah Chen had been living in the small town of Quantico, Virginia, for 3 years, ever since her husband Marcus, a Marine Corps sergeant, had been killed in action overseas. At 33, she'd turned her grief into purpose, working as a trauma nurse at the VA hospital while volunteering weekends at the local animal shelter. It was the kind of quiet, service-oriented life that helped her feel connected to Marcus's memory, even as the pain of his loss remained as sharp as the day she'd received that terrible knock on her door. Architected protagonist foundation and mapped narrative progression strategy. Good start. I'm following the structure of establishing the protagonist with relevant background, modest means, and a connection to the subject matter. Now I need to continue with the setting and the initial discovery of the dog. The shelter sat on the edge of town, a converted warehouse where hundreds of abandoned animals waited for homes that often never came. Sarah had been volunteering there since moving to Virginia, finding solace in caring for creatures who, like her, were trying to survive trauma they couldn't fully express. The dogs she worked with ranged from playful puppies to elderly companions whose families had surrendered them, but she'd never seen anything quite like the German Shepherd in Kennel 7. The morning started normally enough. Sarah dropped off her donations at the front desk and was heading back to her car when she heard the commotion from the kennels. Shelter Director Mike Patterson was arguing with animal control officers about a dog that had been brought in 3 days earlier. "I'm telling you, this one's not adoptable," Mike was saying, his voice tired and frustrated. "He's been here 72 hours, and he won't let anyone near him. Hasn't eaten, hasn't responded to any commands. We've got no choice but to add him to tomorrow's list." Sarah knew what the list meant. Euthanasia for animals deemed too aggressive, too sick, or too damaged to be placed. She'd seen it happen dozens of times, the heartbreaking reality of a shelter system overwhelmed by too many animals and too few resources. "Let me see him first," Sarah heard herself say, pushing through the door into the kennel area. What she found in Kennel 7 made her heart break. The German Shepherd was magnificent, even in his misery. Strong build, intelligent eyes, the kind of dog that should have been someone's beloved companion or working partner. But he was pressed against the back wall of the kennel, his whole body rigid with terror, eyes darting from person to person with a level of fear that went far beyond normal shelter stress. Up close, the dog's condition was devastating. He wasn't just thin. He was severely malnourished, ribs showing through a coat that should have been thick and glossy, but instead was patchy and dull. There were scars on his muzzle and legs, some old and silvered, others still pink and healing. But what caught Sarah's trained medical eye were the marks on his neck and chest, symmetrical patterns that looked disturbingly like repeated taser burns. Most troubling was the tattoo inside his right ear, a military identification number, partially scarred over as if someone had tried to remove it. This wasn't just an abandoned pet. This was a military working dog, and someone had gone to great lengths to erase his identity. "Hey there, soldier," Sarah murmured, kneeling slowly at the kennel door. "I see you. I know you've been through hell." The dog's ear twitched at her voice. Not the cheerful, high-pitched dog voice most people used, but the calm, measured tone she'd learned from Marcus when he'd talked about working with military dogs overseas. His dark eyes fixed on her face, and for just a moment, the terror seemed to ease into something else. Recognition, maybe, or hope. Getting the dog out of the kennel required patience Sarah hadn't known she possessed. Mike wanted to use a catchpole, the standard protocol for aggressive or fearful dogs, but Sarah insisted on trying another way. She sat outside the kennel door for 2 hours, not approaching, not forcing, just talking in that same steady voice about nothing and everything. About Marcus, about her work at the VA, about the other dogs she'd fostered. Slowly, incrementally, the German Shepherd began to move. First, just his head, turning slightly toward her voice. Then a tentative step forward. Then another. When he finally came close enough to sniff her extended hand through the chain link, Sarah felt tears she hadn't cried in months burning behind her eyes. "That's it, brave boy," she whispered. "You're safe now. I promise." The paperwork to adopt him took 20 minutes. The shelter was so eager to avoid euthanizing a dog, they charged her nothing, just the standard vaccination update and a promise to bring him back if it didn't work out. Sarah knew she'd never bring him back. Loading him into her car proved surprisingly easy. The dog seemed almost relieved to leave the shelter, as if the building itself represented a kind of captivity he'd experienced before. He sat quietly in the back seat during the drive to her small rental house on the outskirts of town, occasionally meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror with an expression that looked almost like gratitude. Sarah named him Major, partly because of his obvious military background, but mostly because of the dignified, soldierly bearing he maintained even in his traumatized state. The name seemed to fit his alert, watchful personality. Her veterinarian, Dr. James Rodriguez, confirmed what Sarah had suspected about Major's condition. The dog was severely malnourished and showed signs of chronic abuse. The scars suggested repeated physical trauma, possibly from training methods that crossed the line into torture. The taser burns indicated someone had used pain compliance techniques extensively. But there was nothing wrong with him that time, proper nutrition, and gentle handling couldn't heal. "Where exactly did he come from?" Dr. Rodriguez asked as he completed his examination. "Picked up as a stray outside Quantico," Sarah replied. "But that military tattoo tells a different story. Someone erased most of it, but I can still make out part of the ID number." Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen cases like this before. Sometimes military contractors lose dogs, or dogs escape from private security operations. This boy might have been through things that weren't exactly by the book. The suggestion that Major might have been the victim of illegal military contractor operations was disturbing, but it would explain his extreme fearfulness and the physical evidence of his ordeal." Sarah found herself wondering what the dog had seen during his service, and whether the trauma he displayed was from combat exposure or from something even worse. As the weeks passed, Major began to recover both physically and emotionally. The regular meals and safe environment worked wonders on his condition, and his coat began to develop the healthy shine of a well-cared-for German shepherd. He gained weight steadily, his ribs disappearing under layers of healthy muscle. More importantly, he began to relax around Sarah, no longer flinching every time she approached. But certain behaviors persisted that struck Sarah as unusual. Major would become violently agitated whenever he heard certain vehicle engines, specifically the deep rumble of heavy trucks or the distinctive sound of military-style Humvees. He showed extreme fear of anyone wearing tactical gear or camouflage uniforms, even the ones worn by veterans shopping at the local surplus store. Most puzzling of all was Major's reaction to certain languages. When Sarah had Spanish-speaking friends visit, the dog barely reacted. But the one time her neighbor had a conversation in Arabic on his phone while visiting, Major had a complete panic response that lasted for hours. It was Sarah's colleague from the VA, Dr. James Wu, who first suggested that Major's behavior might be connected to something he'd witnessed rather than experienced directly. "I've worked with combat veterans who have those kinds of specific triggers," James said one evening as they watched Major pace nervously after hearing a Humvee pass on the nearby base road. "PTSD isn't just about what happens to you, it's about what you see, what you associate with danger. If this dog was deployed in certain operations, he might have learned to associate specific things with imminent violence." The comment planted a seed of suspicion in Sarah's mind. The Quantico area was surrounded by military installations and private contractor facilities, the kind of places where classified operations occurred behind high fences and no trespassing signs. If Major had witnessed something illegal, something that powerful people wanted kept secret, it would explain his traumatic responses. Sarah began to pay closer attention to Major's behavior, noting patterns in what triggered his fear responses. Heavy military vehicles caused panic reactions. Arabic or certain Middle Eastern languages provoked intense anxiety. Tactical gear, especially plate carriers and weapons vests, sent him retreating to the farthest corner of whatever room he was in. And strangers with Middle Eastern features, particularly men wearing certain styles of clothing, would cause Major to display the kind of alert, protective behavior she associated with trained military working dogs detecting threats. The pattern suggested that the dog had been involved in operations related to Middle Eastern conflicts or smuggling operations, and that something about those experiences had been deeply traumatic. It was the kind of combination that Sarah associated with illegal arms dealing or unauthorized military contractor activities, operations that occurred in the gray zones between legal warfare and criminal enterprise. But it wasn't until Major was 4 months into his recovery that Sarah discovered the most significant clue to his mysterious past. She'd been giving him his monthly flea and tick treatment, running her hands through his coat to check for any skin issues when she felt something odd at the base of his skull, a small, hard lump under the skin that didn't feel like a normal fatty deposit or cyst. Working carefully, Sarah used her nurse's training to palpate the area, trying to determine if it was something that needed veterinary attention. The lump was regular in shape, almost perfectly rectangular, and seemed to be located just under the skin, rather than deeper in the tissue. Most concerning, it felt slightly warm to the touch, as if it might be electronic, rather than biological. Dr. Rodriguez performed the extraction surgery under local anesthesia, and what he removed made Sarah's blood run cold. It was a small electronic device, no bigger than a grain of rice, with what appeared to be a microchip and tiny battery. This wasn't a standard pet identification chip. Those were passive devices that only activated when scanned. This looked like something that transmitted data actively, a tracking device of the kind used by intelligence agencies or military contractors for high-value assets. Someone had implanted this device in Major, probably when he was just a puppy in training, creating a way to track his location at all times. But who would go to such lengths to monitor a military working dog? And why would they try to erase his identification tattoo while leaving the tracker in place? The answer, when it came to Sarah, was both logical and terrifying. Major hadn't just witnessed criminal activity, he had been used as an unwitting participant in it. The electronic device was probably a GPS tracker, allowing criminals or corrupt contractors to monitor the dog's movements and use that information for their own purposes. Sarah's hands shook as she examined the device more closely under Dr. Rodriguez's magnifying equipment. If her suspicions were correct, Major had been part of a contractor operation that had gone off the books, using military assets for illegal purposes. The dog's training, his responses to specific stimuli, his obvious trauma, it all pointed to involvement in operations that violated military law and possibly international regulations. But if the people who'd implanted this tracker discovered it had been compromised, they might come looking for the dog who carried it, and that meant Major and anyone associated with him could be in serious danger. Sarah spent a sleepless night wrestling with the implications of her discovery. Part of her wanted to simply destroy the device and pretend she'd never found it, hoping that whoever had planted it would assume it had malfunctioned naturally. But her conscience, as both a nurse and a military widow, wouldn't let her ignore the possibility that illegal operations might be continuing, putting other soldiers or military assets at risk. The next morning, Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. She contacted the Criminal Investigation Command at Quantico and asked to speak with someone about what she suspected might be evidence of contractor misconduct. The conversation that followed confirmed her worst fears and set in motion events that would test her courage in ways she never imagined. Special Agent Michael Torres was a CID investigator who'd been tracking military contractor corruption cases for years. When Sarah described what she'd found and her suspicions about its significance, his demeanor became immediately grave. "Ms. Chen, if you're right about this, you may have stumbled onto something that goes way beyond simple contractor oversight issues," Torres said, examining the electronic device under specialized equipment. "We've been investigating reports of unauthorized operations involving military working dogs, operations that appear to be cover for arms trafficking. Using trained military dogs as surveillance assets while conducting illegal weapon sales would be a brilliant way to avoid detection." Torres arranged for the device to be examined by federal agents who specialized in electronic surveillance and military contractor oversight. The results, when they came back 3 days later, confirmed Sarah's suspicions and revealed the scope of the operation she'd accidentally uncovered. The tracking device was sophisticated military-grade equipment worth thousands of dollars. It had been transmitting GPS coordinates and biometric data for nearly 3 years, providing detailed information about Major's movements and even his stress levels during operations. The data revealed regular travel routes to locations that corresponded exactly with known arms trafficking corridors between military bases and unauthorized overseas buyers. But the most alarming discovery was that the device was still active. Despite being removed from Major's body, it continued to transmit location data, which meant the criminals who had planted it could track its current position to Sarah's house. "We need to get you to safety immediately," Agent Rebecca Washington from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service told Sarah during an emergency meeting at the CID office. "The contractor network behind this operation has killed to protect their interests before. If they realize their surveillance has been compromised, they'll come after anyone who might be able to expose them. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the full implications hit her. In trying to help a traumatized military dog, she'd accidentally declared war on a criminal organization with military-grade resources and the ruthlessness to eliminate witnesses. Her home, her livelihood, and possibly her life were now at risk because of her act of compassion. But Agent Washington wasn't finished with her revelations. The investigation into the tracking device had uncovered evidence of a massive arms trafficking operation run by former military contractors who had been using their access to military installations and equipment for illegal weapons sales. The criminals had been using military working dogs like Major as mobile surveillance platforms for years, implanting them with tracking devices and deploying them on training missions that were actually reconnaissance for illegal arms deals. Major's specialized training had made him particularly valuable to the operation because he'd been certified for explosive detection and could access secure areas that humans couldn't. The dog had probably witnessed regular criminal activity throughout his service career, which explained his traumatic responses to tactical gear, Middle Eastern languages, and heavy military vehicles. The operation is worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Washington explained. They've been selling everything from small arms to anti-aircraft weapons to unauthorized buyers in conflict zones. Major was deployed on dozens of these missions, providing cover as a legitimate military asset while the transactions occurred. It's been nearly impossible for us to infiltrate the network or catch them in the act. But now, thanks to Major's escape and your discovery of the tracking device, we have the evidence we need to bring down the entire organization. The plan that Washington outlined was both simple and terrifying. Sarah would continue caring for Major at her house, but federal agents would establish a covert surveillance operation on her property. When the criminals came looking for their missing asset, and Washington was certain they would, law enforcement would be ready to arrest them. We'll have agents positioned around your property 24/7, Washington promised. But I won't lie to you, Sarah. There's still significant risk involved. These people are former military operators who don't hesitate to use force when they feel threatened. They have training, equipment, and resources that make them extremely dangerous. Sarah looked down at Major, who sat pressed against her leg in the conference room, his body tense but trusting. The dog had survived unimaginable trauma and exploitation, depending on whoever might show him kindness to keep him safe. Now, it was Sarah's turn to show the same kind of courage that Major had displayed just by surviving his ordeal. "What do you need me to do?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. The next 3 weeks passed in a state of constant tension as federal agents transformed Sarah's modest rental house into a carefully concealed fortress. Surveillance equipment was hidden throughout the property, motion sensors were placed along all access points, and armed agents took up positions in her garage, the neighbor's empty house, and even in her own attic. Sarah tried to maintain her normal routine, going to work at the VA hospital and caring for Major as if nothing had changed. But she was constantly aware of the hidden watchers, the electronic eyes monitoring every movement on her property. Major seemed to sense the tension as well, staying close to Sarah and showing renewed signs of the hypervigilance that had marked his early days after rescue. The waiting was the hardest part. Washington had warned Sarah that the contractors might take time to react to the loss of their tracking device, perhaps hoping Major would be returned to military custody through normal channels. But eventually, they would have to investigate, and when they did, the confrontation would be swift and potentially deadly. The attack came on a Wednesday night, in late November, just after Sarah had finished her evening shift at the hospital and settled in with Major for dinner. She was heating up leftover pasta when the security system that the agents had installed began flashing silent warnings that motion sensors around the property had been triggered. Sarah moved to the window and peered out into the darkness, seeing nothing unusual in the quiet residential street. But somewhere in the shadows, she knew former military operators were moving toward her house with the intention of recovering their asset and eliminating anyone who might threaten their operation. The first sign of trouble was Major's behavior. The dog suddenly went rigid, his ears pressed flat against his head, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The kind of alert response Sarah had never heard from him before. Then she heard it too, the distinctive sound of heavy vehicles approaching, their engines running low and slow, trying to be stealthy but unmistakable to anyone who knew military equipment. Within minutes, 3 black SUVs had positioned themselves around Sarah's house, blocking the street in both directions. She could see armed men moving between the vehicles, their movements efficient and coordinated like a military operation. They wore civilian clothes but moved with the precision of trained soldiers, and Sarah recognized the tactical gear and weapons as military-grade equipment. But what the criminals didn't know was that their every movement was being monitored by federal agents who had been waiting for exactly this moment. As soon as the SUVs appeared on surveillance cameras, Washington had given the signal for her team to move into action. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense. The contractors had expected to find a civilian nurse and her dog in an undefended rental house. Instead, they encountered a coordinated federal law enforcement operation that had been planned specifically to counter their assault. Sarah crouched in her bathtub, with Major pressed against her, as she'd been instructed, listening to the sharp commands of federal agents identifying themselves and demanding surrender. Outside, she could hear the controlled chaos of a tactical operation, the boom of flash-bang grenades, the authoritative voices of agents establishing control, the sound of handcuffs clicking as suspects were secured. The contractors' sophisticated operation had been shattered by superior planning and overwhelming force. Their years of illegal arms dealing brought to an end by the evidence provided by a traumatized military dog who'd finally found someone willing to protect him. In the aftermath of the raid, Sarah learned the full scope of what Major had inadvertently helped to uncover. The arms trafficking operation had been responsible for selling hundreds of millions of dollars worth of illegal weapons to unauthorized buyers in conflict zones around the world. The contractors had been using military working dogs like Major as unwitting surveillance assets for years, implanting them with tracking devices and deploying them on missions that provided perfect cover for their criminal activities. Major's escape from the contractor facility had been a devastating blow to their operational security, which explained their desperate attempt to recover him. But more than money and weapons had been at stake. The investigation that followed the raid revealed that the criminal organization had been responsible for the deaths of several military personnel who had accidentally discovered their operations. Major's testimony, in the form of his traumatic responses to specific stimuli, had helped law enforcement understand not just the scope of the trafficking operation, but also its violent nature. The dog's reactions to Arabic, tactical gear, and heavy vehicles had provided crucial clues about where and how the illegal operations had been conducted. Sarah stood in her damaged living room a week after the raid, looking down at Major, who lay peacefully on his dog bed, finally relaxed for the first time since she'd brought him home. The dog had survived another trauma, but this time he'd had a human protector willing to risk her life to keep him safe. Major had grown considerably during his months with Sarah. His coat now gleamed with health. His body had filled out with proper nutrition, and his eyes had lost much of the fearful wariness that had marked him as broken. He was still young, still healing from psychological wounds that might never fully close, but he was alive and safe and free from the exploitation that had shadowed his entire working life. More importantly, Major's ordeal had served a purpose that gave meaning to his suffering. The evidence he had unknowingly carried had brought down a criminal empire, saved lives, and protected other military working dogs from being exploited by corrupt contractors. In rescuing him from the shelter, Sarah had accidentally struck a blow for justice that would reverberate through the military contractor oversight system for years. The financial rewards from the case were substantial. The federal government offered significant compensation for civilians who provided information leading to major contractor fraud convictions, and Sarah's role in uncovering the trafficking operation qualified her for a settlement that would allow her to buy her own home and establish a rescue sanctuary for retired military working dogs. But more important than money was the knowledge that her act of compassion had made a real difference. As Sarah watched Major play in her backyard with the other retired military dog she'd begun fostering, she reflected on the strange turns her life had taken since that August morning at the shelter. She had adopted Major out of recognition, seeing in his traumatized eyes something that reminded her of the soldiers she treated at the VA, men and women broken by service and betrayal. She had never imagined that her $0 adoption would lead to one of the largest military contractor fraud cases in Virginia history, or that caring for a traumatized military dog would put her in the middle of a life-or-death confrontation with armed criminals. But perhaps that was the way life worked. The most significant events often grew from the smallest acts of kindness, and the most important discoveries were made by people who simply refused to ignore suffering when they encountered it. 6 months later, Sarah received a call from Agent Washington with news that brought the story full circle. The Department of Defense had decided to officially retire Major with full military honors, recognizing both his service and his role in uncovering the contractor fraud. They were offering Sarah the opportunity to participate in the ceremony at Quantico, where Major would receive his retirement medal and be formally released from duty. Sarah accepted immediately, dressing in her late husband's Marine Corps dress blues that she'd kept carefully preserved. As they traveled to the base, she wondered if Major would remember the place where his trauma had begun, and whether the formal ceremony would bring him peace or trigger his old fears. The answer came as soon as they arrived at the parade ground. Major stepped out of the car with his head high, his bearing proud and alert, not the terrorized dog who'd cowered in the shelter kennel, but a soldier coming home. When the commanding officer placed the medal around his neck and the assembled Marines saluted, Major sat at attention beside Sarah with the same dignity and courage that had carried him through years of exploitation and trauma. After the ceremony, as Sarah walked Major across the parade ground where other retired military working dogs played with their new families, she felt a profound sense of completion. Marcus would have been proud, not just of what she'd accomplished in bringing down the criminal operation, but of the sanctuary she was building to honor the service of dogs like Major. The broken warrior that nobody had wanted at the shelter had become the key to exposing a betrayal of military values that had gone unchecked for years. In saving Major's life, Sarah had inadvertently saved many other lives as well, proving that acts of compassion can have consequences that ripple far beyond what we can imagine. This incredible story of Major and Sarah proves that the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the most extraordinary outcomes. If this amazing tale of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bond between veterans and their dogs moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope. Don't forget to subscribe to Second Chance Stories and ring that notification bell for more true stories of rescue, redemption, and second chances. And let us know in the comments what part of Major's journey touched your heart the most. Your support helps us continue bringing these life-changing stories to light, because every dog deserves a second chance, and every story of courage deserves to be told.